In the bustling heart of Denver's financial district, a struggling single father named Gerald Mendez cleans office buildings at dawn while the city sleeps, earning barely enough to keep him and his 8-year-old son afloat. His world revolves around double shifts, overdue bills, and dreams he's convinced himself to abandon. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening, at an upscale charity gala he's working, everything changes when tech heiress Victoria Ashworth's 5-year-old daughter begins choking on a piece of candy at table 7. Without hesitation, Gerald drops his cleaning supplies and springs into action, performing the life-saving maneuver that rescues the child. But before he can even catch his breath, security escorts him away, and he disappears into the night, leaving behind only his work badge and the lingering memory of a father's desperate courage. What Gerald doesn't know is that Victoria's brush with nearly losing her daughter has awakened something profound within the Billionaire CEO, a desperate need to find the stranger who showed more genuine care in 30 seconds than she's experienced in years of calculated business relationships. But when gratitude crosses the boundaries of social class, can it survive the weight of pride and the glare of public scrutiny? Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if the story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have something even more extraordinary waiting for you. Gerald Mendez had learned early that life dealt cards from the bottom of the deck. At 28, he carried the weight of the world on shoulders that ached from scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins in Denver's gleaming corporate towers. His one-bedroom apartment in the struggling neighborhood of Riverside spoke of a man making do. Mismatched furniture rescued from thrift stores, a mattress on the floor for his son Diego, and a kitchen table that wobbled when they shared their daily meal of rice and beans. The walls were bare except for Diego's crayon drawings and a single photograph of his late wife Rosa, lost to a car accident 3 years prior. The real story of Gerald's life lived in the sacrifices that others never saw. He worked the overnight cleaning shift at Premier Building Services, starting at 10 p.m. and finishing at 6 a.m., then rushed home to get Diego ready for school before catching a few hours of sleep. His afternoons were spent working at Marta's Diner, waiting tables for tips that barely covered their basic needs. The math was always the same, never quite enough. Rent was $800, groceries were $200, Diego's school supplies and clothes seemed to cost more every month, and the old Honda in the parking lot needed repairs he couldn't afford. But Gerald had pride, the kind of fierce dignity that comes from knowing you're doing everything possible for your child. He spoke to Diego in Spanish at home, keeping Rosa's memory alive through stories and traditions. He helped him with homework at the diner during his breaks, teaching him that education was the ladder out of their circumstances. When other kids had new backpacks and fancy sneakers, Diego had a father who showed up to every school event he could manage, even if he arrived exhausted and still smelling faintly of industrial cleaner. His supervisor at Premier Building Services, a gruff man named Frank, appreciated Gerald's work ethic. He was reliable, thorough, and invisible, exactly what clients wanted in their cleaning staff. The corporate executives whose offices he maintained each night never saw his face, never learned his name, never knew that the man who emptied their trash cans was raising a brilliant boy who dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Tuesday evenings were usually Gerald's hardest shift. The Meridian Tower housed 3 major corporations, including Ashworth Dynamics, the tech conglomerate that had revolutionized cloud computing and made its founder one of the youngest billionaires in America. The offices were pristine, clinical spaces where million-dollar deals were made daily, where people earned more in a year than Gerald would see in a lifetime. On this particular Tuesday, however, the usually empty 20th floor buzzed with activity. The Denver Children Foundation was hosting their annual gala in Ashworth Dynamics' corporate event space, a glittering affair where the city's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks and feel good about their charitable contributions. Gerald had assigned to work around the event, maintaining the restrooms and cleaning any spills that occurred during the evening. He moved through the periphery like a ghost, restocking paper towels and emptying wastebaskets while women in $1,000 gowns sipped champagne and men in custom suits discussed their latest acquisitions. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was cleaning up after a charity event designed to help children like Diego, while earning wages that barely kept them above the poverty line. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and fresh flowers that cost more than Gerald's monthly rent. He watched from the service corridor as the guests mingled, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter echoing off marble walls. These were people who lived in a different universe, where money was never a concern, where children attended private schools and summer camps, where medical bills didn't mean choosing between rent and groceries. Victoria Ashworth commanded attention, even in this room full of influential people. At 34, she had built her empire with ruthless efficiency and brilliant innovation. Her daughter, 5-year-old Lily, stayed close to her mother's side, clutching a small purse that matched Victoria's designer dress. The child was beautiful but seemed overwhelmed by the crowd, occasionally tugging on her mother's gown for comfort. Gerald noticed these details because he understood children, understood how overwhelming adult spaces could be for little ones. Diego had been to enough diners and public spaces to know how to behave, but he remembered his son's wide eyes and quiet demeanor when he was Lily's age, trying to navigate a world built for grown-ups. As the evening progressed, Gerald continued his work, slipping in and out of the event space to address any cleaning needs. He was refilling soap dispensers in the men's room when he heard commotion from the main ballroom, raised voices, someone calling for help. His paternal instincts kicked in immediately. The tone was urgent, panicked, the kind of cry that made every father's heart race. Without thinking, Gerald dropped his supplies and rushed toward the sound. In the ballroom, he saw a crowd gathered around table 7, where Victoria Ashworth knelt beside her daughter. Lily was on the floor, her face turning blue, her small hands clawing at her throat. She was choking. The wealthy guests stood frozen, unsure what to do. Someone was shouting for a doctor. Security was radioing for paramedics, but precious seconds were ticking away, and the little girl was dying. Gerald didn't see the designer gowns or the judging eyes. He didn't think about his place or his uniform or the fact that he didn't belong in this room. He saw only a child in distress, a mother's terror, and a situation that demanded immediate action. He pushed through the crowd, dropped to his knees beside Lily, and quickly assessed the situation. The child was conscious, but unable to breathe, her airway clearly blocked. Gerald had learned the Heimlich maneuver during a basic first aid course that Premier Building Services had provided for employees, one of the few benefits of his job. "I can help," Gerald said firmly to Victoria, whose eyes were wild with panic. "I know what to do." Without waiting for permission, Gerald positioned himself behind Lily, placing his hands correctly, and began the abdominal thrusts. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th thrust, a piece of hard candy shot from Lily's mouth, and the child immediately began gasping for air, crying with relief. The ballroom erupted in cheers and applause, but Gerald barely heard it. He was focused on Lily, making sure the child was breathing normally, that her color was returning, that she was truly safe. Victoria was sobbing, reaching for her daughter, her hands shaking as she pulled Lily into her arms. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving my baby." But before Gerald could respond, before he could even process what had happened, hotel security was there, concerned about liability, about proper procedures. The paramedics arrived and took over, checking Lily's vital signs and recommending a hospital visit as a precaution. In the chaos that followed, worried guests, flashing cameras from society photographers, urgent conversations about medical protocols, Gerald quietly slipped away. He returned to the service corridor, picked up his abandoned cleaning supplies, and tried to return to his routine. But his hands were shaking, his heart was racing, and he couldn't stop thinking about the terror in Victoria's eyes, the blue tinge to Lily's lips, the weight of that small body in his arms. 20 minutes later, Frank appeared in the corridor, his face grim. "Mendez, you need to go. Corporate's orders. Apparently there was some kind of incident and they want all non-essential staff cleared out." Gerald nodded, gathered his things, and headed for the employee exit. As he waited for the service elevator, he could hear the gala continuing in the ballroom, the crisis already becoming a story that guests would tell at future dinner parties. But for Gerald, the night felt significant in a way he couldn't quite name. He had saved a life tonight. In a room full of powerful, wealthy people, he had been the one who acted, the one who made the difference. It was a moment that reminded him of who he was beneath the uniform and the exhaustion, a father, a protector, someone who mattered. As the elevator doors closed, Gerald caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished steel. He looked tired, older than his 28 years, But there was something different in his eyes. For the first time in months, he felt proud of himself for something beyond just surviving another day. He had no idea that upstairs, Victoria Ashworth was desperately asking security for information about the man who had saved her daughter's life. He had no idea that his simple act of compassion was about to change everything, not just for him and Diego, but for everyone whose lives they would touch in the extraordinary days ahead. Outside, Denver's skyline twinkled with promise, unaware that somewhere in its depths, two worlds had briefly touched, and neither would ever be the same again. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Gerald's hand shot out instinctively to silence it before it could wake Diego, whose small form was curled up on the air mattress they shared in their studio apartment. The math was always brutal. 6 hours at the cleaning company, 2 hours to get Diego ready and off to school, 3 hours of sleep if he was lucky, then the afternoon shift at Marta's diner until evening. Gerald Mendez hadn't always lived paycheck to paycheck. 3 years ago, he and Rosa had been building something together, a small landscaping business that was finally starting to turn a profit. They had a modest house in Aurora, with a yard where Diego could play, dreams of expanding the business, maybe even having another child. Rosa had been the dreamer, always talking about the house they'd buy someday, the vacation they'd take to Mexico to visit her grandmother, the college fund they'd start for Diego.
Then came the phone call that changed everything. A car accident on Interstate 25 during a winter storm. Rosa had been driving home from her job at the local elementary school when black ice sent her vehicle into oncoming traffic. The insurance payout barely covered the funeral expenses, and without Rosa's steady income and emotional support, the business died within 6 months. Gerald had tried to keep it going, but without her organizational skills and client relationships, customers disappeared, one by one. The house went into foreclosure. The truck was repossessed. Everything they'd built together crumbled like a house of cards, leaving Carmen with an 8-year-old son, no savings, and skills that seemed worthless in the modern economy. She'd completed 2 years of community college before Diego was born, studying early childhood education, but never finished her degree. In the 3 years since Miguel's death, that incomplete education felt like a cruel reminder of yet another dream abandoned. The studio apartment in Riverside was all she could afford on her combined wages from Premier Building Services and Marta's Diner. At $450 a month, it was a basement unit with thin walls, temperamental plumbing, and windows that barely let in natural light. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't the kind of place where children played outside unsupervised. Diego spent his after-school hours at the community center or doing homework in the corner booth at Marta's while Carmen worked her second shift. Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, helped watch Diego during the transition hours when Carmen's schedules overlapped. She was a widow herself, understood the particular challenges of raising a child alone. Sometimes Carmen would find her teaching Diego basic Mandarin phrases or sharing homemade dumplings that stretched their grocery budget a little further. It was kindness without judgment, the kind of support that kept Carmen's pride intact while acknowledging their reality. Diego was resilient in the way that children forced to grow up too quickly often are. He never complained about their circumstances, never asked for things they couldn't afford, never expressed embarrassment about their situation. At 8, he understood that money was always tight, that saying, "we can't afford it," wasn't rejection, but reality. He learned to be content with library books instead of new toys, with generic cereal instead of name brands, with hand-me-down clothes that Carmen carefully mended and cleaned. But Diego was also brilliant. His teachers consistently praised his curiosity, his problem-solving abilities, his advanced reading level. Carmen attended every parent-teacher conference she could manage, sometimes arriving directly from her cleaning shift with exhaustion written across her face, but determination in her eyes. She knew that education was Diego's ticket to a different life, and she was willing to sacrifice anything to ensure he had that opportunity. 20 miles away, in the exclusive Highlands Ranch neighborhood, Victoria Ashworth lived in a world where Gerald's monthly rent wouldn't cover a single dinner at her favorite restaurant. The Ashworth estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured grounds, featuring a main house that could accommodate 50 guests, a separate guest cottage, stables, and a private lake. The property was worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Victoria had built Ashworth Dynamics from a college dorm room idea to a tech empire worth $3.2 billion. At 34, she was regularly featured on Forbes lists and technology magazine covers, praised for her innovative approach to cloud computing and data security. Her company employed over 8,000 people across 6 countries, and her personal wealth continued to grow exponentially with each quarterly report. But success had come at a cost that Victoria was only beginning to understand. Her marriage to James Ashworth had ended in divorce 2 years prior, a casualty of 18-hour workdays and fundamental disagreements about work-life balance. James had wanted more family time, more presence, more of the woman he'd fallen in love with in graduate school. Victoria had wanted to build an empire, to prove that a woman could dominate the tech world, to achieve the kind of success that would ensure she never felt powerless again. Lily was the one bright spot in Victoria's carefully controlled universe. At 5 years old, she was precocious, curious, and blessed with her mother's intelligence. She attended the exclusive Denver Academy, where tuition cost more than many families' annual income. Her days were structured around Mandarin lessons, violin practice, advanced math tutoring, and creative arts programs designed to maximize her developmental potential. Victoria loved her daughter fiercely, but she loved her in the way successful executives love their most important projects, with intense focus when present, but with frequent absences due to other priorities. Lily's daily care was managed by a rotation of nannies, tutors, and household staff. Her social life was coordinated by assistants. Her meals were prepared by a private chef who specialized in child nutrition.
The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that she'd built a company focused on connecting people through technology while struggling to truly connect with her own daughter. Business dinners, board meetings, investor calls, and strategic planning sessions filled her calendar from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. most days. She attended Lily's school events when possible, but often found herself checking emails during dance recitals or taking urgent calls during parent gatherings. Victoria's own childhood had been marked by emotional distance and high expectations. Her parents, both professors at UC Boulder, had valued achievement above affection, academic success above emotional connection. She'd learned early that love was conditional, earned through accomplishments rather than freely given. This understanding had served her well in the business world, where relationships were transactional and success was measured in quantifiable metrics. The charity gala at her corporate headquarters had been Patricia Morrison's idea. Her assistant believed that high-profile philanthropic events were good for the company's public image and Victoria's personal brand. Victoria attended such events regularly, writing substantial checks to worthy causes while networking with other influential figures. It was corporate citizenship as strategic advantage, charitable giving as reputation management. She hadn't expected the evening to be anything more than another obligation on her carefully managed calendar. The Denver Children's Foundation was a respectable cause. The guest list included potential business partners, and the event would generate positive media coverage. Victoria had planned to make her appearance, deliver brief remarks about corporate social responsibility, and return home by 9 p.m. to review quarterly projections. Lily's presence at the event had been a last-minute decision. Her regular nanny had called in sick, the backup nanny was unavailable, and Victoria's ex-husband was traveling for business. Rather than miss the event entirely, Victoria had decided to bring Lily along, reasoning that exposure to charitable work would be educational for her daughter. The child had been well behaved throughout the cocktail hour, staying close to Victoria's side, politely greeting the adults who stopped to comment on how beautiful and well-mannered she was. But as the evening progressed, Lily had grown restless, overwhelmed by the noise and crowds. She'd been quietly playing with some hard candies from her small purse when the choking incident occurred.
In that moment, when Lily's airway was blocked, when her face began turning blue, Victoria experienced a terror she'd never known existed. All her wealth, all her influence, all her carefully constructed success meant nothing if she couldn't save her child. She was completely powerless, watching her daughter dying while a room full of influential people stood frozen in shock. Then Gerald had appeared, a man Victoria had never noticed, wearing a cleaning service uniform, moving with purpose and competence while everyone else hesitated. In 30 seconds, this stranger had done what Victoria couldn't do, what none of the powerful people in the room could do. He'd saved Lily's life with skill, courage, and immediate action. As Victoria sat in the hospital waiting room later that night, watching Lily sleep peacefully after the doctors had confirmed she was completely fine, she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had disappeared before she could properly thank him. Security had been unable to provide information about the cleaning staff member, citing privacy policies and liability concerns. The event coordinator claimed they didn't have detailed records of subcontracted service personnel. But Victoria Ashworth hadn't built a billion-dollar company by accepting no as a final answer. She had resources, connections, and a determination that had overcome every obstacle in her path. Finding the man who saved her daughter's life had become her most important mission, more urgent than any business deal, more critical than any board meeting. For the first time in years, Victoria was willing to use every tool at her disposal, not for profit or strategic advantage, but for something far more personal. She was going to find Gerald Mendez, whether Gerald wanted to be found or not. And when she did, Victoria intended to make sure that the man who saved what mattered most to her would never have to worry about anything again. The search would begin at dawn, with resources that Gerald couldn't imagine, and a determination that would change both their lives forever. The morning after the charity gala arrived with the same ruthless punctuality that had governed Gerald's life for 3 years. The alarm clock's harsh buzz at 4:30 a.m. found him already awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling of their studio apartment, replaying the events of the previous evening. His hands still trembled slightly when he thought about those terrifying seconds when little Lily Ashworth was dying in front of a room full of helpless millionaires. Diego stirred on the air mattress beside him, his 8-year-old face peaceful in sleep. Gerald carefully extracted himself from the thin blankets, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had perfected the art of not waking his child during shift changes. The apartment was cold. He'd kept the heat low to save money, and he pulled on his work clothes quickly, the same uniform he'd worn to save a life 12 hours earlier. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably, but Gerald moved through his morning routine with efficient precision. Instant coffee in a chipped mug and a piece of toast with peanut butter, and the mental calculation that always accompanied his meals. $2.50 for breakfast, leaving $23.47 for the rest of the week's groceries. He'd grown skilled at this arithmetic of survival, though it never got easier.
As he prepared Diego's lunch, a sandwich, an apple, and a juice box that cost more than Gerald's breakfast, he found his mind drifting back to Victoria Ashworth's tear-streaked face. The gratitude in her eyes had been so raw, so genuine, that it had stirred something in Gerald he'd thought had died with Rosa. It had been years since anyone had looked at him like he mattered, like he was more than just another invisible service worker. The bus ride to Diego's school was a 20-minute journey through neighborhoods that marked the clear boundaries of Denver's economic divide. They started in Riverside, where broken street lights and chain-link fences spoke of neglect and limited resources. As the bus wound its way toward Diego's school, the houses grew larger, the lawns more manicured, the cars newer and more expensive. "Papa, you're quiet today," Diego observed, his backpack clutched in his lap. It was secondhand, purchased from Goodwill for $3, but Gerald had carefully mended a torn strap and cleaned it until it looked almost new. "Just thinking, mijo," Gerald replied, using the affectionate term that always made Diego smile. "How's your science project coming along?" Diego's face lit up with excitement. At 8, he possessed a curiosity about the world that constantly amazed Gerald. Despite their circumstances, or perhaps because of them, Diego approached learning with an intensity that reminded Gerald of Rosa. She had been the one with big dreams, the one who believed that education could lift them out of poverty. "Mrs. Patterson says my volcano is one of the best she's ever seen," Diego said proudly. "And guess what? She wants to enter it in the district science fair. Can I do it, Papa? Please?" Gerald's heart clenched. The district science fair would require materials they couldn't afford, transportation to venues across the city, possibly even overnight stays. But looking at his son's hopeful face, Gerald found himself nodding. "Of course, mijo, we'll figure it out." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep, but one he'd made anyway. That was parenthood in poverty, an endless series of impossible promises driven by love and sustained by hope that somehow, some way, things would work out. After dropping Diego at school, Gerald caught another bus to Marta's diner for his afternoon shift. The diner was an institution in the Riverside neighborhood, a place where construction workers, mechanics, and other working-class folks could get a decent meal at a reasonable price. Marta herself was a fierce woman in her 60s who emigrated from El Salvador 30 years earlier and built her business through sheer determination and exceptional cooking. "You look like hell, Gerald," Marta observed as he tied his apron. Her English carried the musical accent of her homeland, and her dark eyes missed nothing. "Rough night at the cleaning job?" Gerald hesitated. Marta had become something of a surrogate mother to him over the past year, offering advice and occasionally slipping extra food into containers for him to take home to Diego. But how could he explain what had happened at the gala? How could he describe the feeling of saving a child's life in a room full of people who earned more in an hour than he made in a month? "Something like that," he said finally. "Just one of those nights that makes you think." The lunch rush at Marta's was always intense. Gerald moved between tables with practiced efficiency, taking orders, delivering food, and clearing dishes, while maintaining the friendly demeanor that earned him decent tips. The customers were mostly regulars. Joe the mechanic who always ordered the same meatloaf special, Mrs. Santos who came in every Tuesday for coffee and gossip, the construction crew from the Henderson project who liked to joke around but always tipped well. During a brief lull around 2 p.m., Gerald was wiping down tables when Marta appeared beside him with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a booth in the corner. "You're moving like a man with ghosts on his shoulders." Gerald obeyed, accepting the coffee gratefully. Marta slid into the opposite seat, her weathered hands folded on the table between them. "I know that look," she said quietly. "It's the same look my husband had after he pulled a child from a burning building back in San Salvador, like he'd seen something that changed him." Gerald stared into his coffee, surprised by how perceptive Marta was. "What happened to your husband?" "He became a different man. Not bad different, but different. He started believing that maybe he was put on this earth for a reason bigger than just getting by. Made him brave in ways that scared me sometimes." Before Gerald could respond, the diner's door chimed, and a man in an expensive suit walked in. He looked completely out of place among the working-class clientele, his clothes probably costing more than Gerald made in 6 months. The man's eyes swept the room until they landed on Gerald, and he approached their table with purposeful steps. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Are you Gerald Mendez?" Gerald's blood ran cold. His first instinct was to deny it, to fade back into invisibility, but something in the man's expression, not threatening but urgent, made him nod slowly. "My name is Robert Harrison. I represent Victoria Ashworth. She's been looking for you since last night." Marta's eyebrows shot up, and Gerald could feel the attention of other customers shifting their way. A billionaire looking for him? It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than his real life. "I don't understand," Gerald said carefully. "I just did what anyone would have done."
Harrison smiled, and Gerald caught a glimpse of genuine warmth beneath the professional facade. "Mr. Mendez, what you did last night was extraordinary. You saved Miss Ashworth's daughter's life. She wants to thank you properly, and she'd like to meet with you, if you're willing." Gerald's mind raced. Victoria Ashworth, one of the most powerful women in Denver, wanted to meet with him. Part of him was terrified by the prospect, but another part was curious. What could someone like her possibly want with someone like him? "She understands you're a working man with responsibilities," Harrison continued, pulling out a business card. "She's prepared to compensate you for your time. Would you be available this evening?" Marta kicked Gerald under the table, her eyes wide with excitement. Around them, the diner had gone quiet, other customers straining to hear the conversation. Gerald looked at the business card, thick, expensive paper with embossed lettering that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. This was a doorway to a world he'd never imagined entering, but it was also a world that might have something to offer Diego. The science fair, college savings, a future beyond the endless cycle of double shifts and overdue bills. "What time?" Gerald asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Harrison's smile widened. "Would 7 o'clock work? There's a car service that can pick you up wherever is convenient." A car service? Gerald had never ridden in anything more luxurious than a city bus, but he found himself nodding. "I can meet you somewhere. I don't need a car." "The car's no trouble, Mr. Mendez. Miss Ashworth insists." After Harrison left, Marta grabbed Gerald's arm with surprising strength. "Dios mío, Gerald, do you know what this could mean?" Gerald did know, and that's what terrified him. This could mean everything. Opportunity for Diego, a chance to escape the grinding poverty that had defined their lives since Rosa's death, but it could also mean disappointment, false hope, or worse, the possibility that he'd somehow misunderstood what was being offered. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. Customers who had overheard the conversation looked at him with new interest, as if he'd suddenly become someone worth noticing. When Mrs. Santos asked what it was all about, Gerald found himself unable to explain. How could he describe something he didn't understand himself? At 5 p.m., Gerald clocked out and caught the bus home. Marta was waiting at the kitchen table, homework spread before him, his face lighting up when Gerald walked in. "Papa, how was work?" Gerald sat down beside his son, looking at the math problems covering Diego's notebook. Second-grade arithmetic that his brilliant boy completed easily, while Gerald struggled with calculations that would determine their family's future. "Diego," Gerald said carefully, "what would you think if Papa had to go to an important meeting tonight? Mrs. Chen could watch you for a few hours." Diego's eyes grew wide. "Is it about a better job? Are we going to move to a house with a yard?" The hope in his son's voice was like a knife in his chest. Diego had learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford, but he couldn't hide his dreams entirely. A yard, his own bedroom, maybe even a dog. Simple things that seemed impossibly out of reach. "I don't know yet, Miko," Gerald said honestly, "but it might be an opportunity." As Gerald showered and put on his only decent shirt, a button-down that Rosa had bought him for job interviews 4 years ago, he caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror. He looked tired, older than his 28 years, but there was something different in his eyes. The same thing Marta had noticed, the same thing he'd felt in the elevator after saving Lily Ashworth. For the first time in 3 years, Gerald Mendez looked like a man who believed he might matter. And as he waited for a car that cost more than his monthly rent to arrive at his apartment building, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was about to change. The black sedan that arrived at Gerald's apartment building at exactly 6:45 p.m. looked like it belonged in a different universe. Its polished surface reflected the flickering streetlights of Riverside, and several neighbors had gathered on their stoops to stare at the unprecedented sight. Gerald emerged from the building in his best shirt and only pair of dress pants, feeling like an imposter in his own skin. The driver, a professional man in his 50s, stepped out and opened the rear door without a word. Gerald had never experienced such treatment. The leather seats were softer than any furniture in his apartment, and the car's interior was quieter than any space he'd ever occupied. As they pulled away from Riverside and began the journey toward the wealthy Highlands Ranch neighborhood,
Gerald watched his world disappear behind tinted windows. During the 30-minute drive, Gerald's anxiety built with each mile. What did Victoria Ashworth actually want from him? The business card in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, a tangible reminder that he was crossing into territory where he didn't belong. He thought about Diego, probably doing homework at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, blissfully unaware that his father was heading toward a meeting that might change everything. The Ashworth estate appeared gradually through perfectly manicured trees, its scale becoming apparent only as the sedan wound up a private drive that was longer than Gerald's entire street. The house, calling it a house seemed inadequate, sprawled across the landscape like a small resort. Warm light spilled from dozens of windows, and Gerald could see formal gardens extending into the darkness. The monthly utilities for this place probably exceeded his annual income.
Robert Harrison met Gerald at the front door. His earlier professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine relief. "Mr. Mendez, thank you for coming. Ms. Ashworth is waiting in the library. She's been quite anxious to meet you." The library was unlike anything Gerald had ever seen outside of movies. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked both expensive and well-read. A fireplace crackled at one end of the room, and comfortable reading chairs were strategically placed to take advantage of both the warmth and the light. Victoria Ashworth stood near the fireplace, and Gerald was struck by how different she looked from the composed executive he'd seen at the charity gala. She was smaller than he remembered, more vulnerable somehow. Her designer dress had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, and her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail. But it was her eyes that caught Gerald's attention. They held the same raw gratitude he'd seen the night before, mixed with something that looked like desperation. "Mr. Mendez," she said, extending her hand. "I can't begin to express how grateful I am that you agreed to come." Gerald shook her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Please, call me Gerald, and I want you to know what I did last night. Any parent would have done the same thing." Victoria's smile was sad. "That's where you're wrong, Gerald. There were dozens of parents in that room last night, and not one of them moved. They all stood there, paralyzed, while my daughter was dying. But you acted. You saved her life." She gestured toward the chairs by the fireplace, and Gerald sat carefully, acutely aware of the expensive fabric beneath him. Victoria took the chair across from him, leaning forward with an intensity that made Gerald slightly uncomfortable. "Tell me about yourself, about your family, your life. I want to understand who you are." Gerald hesitated. His life wasn't something he was accustomed to discussing with billionaires, but something in Victoria's expression, genuine interest rather than polite curiosity, encouraged him to be honest. "I have a son, Diego. He's 8. Lost my wife 3 years ago in a car accident." Gerald's voice caught slightly on the words. Even after 3 years, talking about Rosa remained difficult. "I work 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day. It's not much, but it's honest work." Victoria listened without interrupting, her attention completely focused on his words. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with an expression Gerald couldn't quite read. "You said any parent would have done what you did, but I couldn't. When I saw Lily choking, when I realized she was dying, I froze. All my wealth, all my power, all my success, none of it mattered. I was completely helpless. You weren't." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "I just reacted. I didn't think about it." "That's exactly my point." Victoria stood and moved to a side table where a crystal decanter sat alongside 2 glasses. "Can I offer you something to drink? Water, coffee, something stronger?" "Water's fine," Gerald replied, watching as she poured from a pitcher that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Victoria handed him the glass and sat back down, this time choosing the chair closer to his. "Gerald, I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about what happened last night. Not just the choking incident, but everything around it. The fact that you were there, working, invisible to everyone else in that room.
The fact that you acted when no one else could. The fact that you saved my daughter's life and then disappeared without asking for anything in return." She paused, taking a sip of what appeared to be wine from her own glass. "Gerald, I've built my entire life around the belief that success means having control, having power over outcomes. But last night, I realized that all my control and power meant nothing without someone like you, someone willing to act when action was needed." Gerald felt increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mrs. Ashworth, please." "Victoria." "Victoria, I didn't save your daughter to get anything in return. I saved her because she needed saving, because that's what you do when a child is in danger." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "And that's exactly why I need to help you. Because you don't expect it. Because you don't think you deserve it. Because you're exactly the kind of person who should be helped." She stood and moved to a desk in the corner of the room, returning with a leather folder. "I've been researching you, Gerald. I hope you don't mind, but I needed to understand your situation fully." Gerald's stomach clenched. The idea of Victoria Ashworth investigating his life was both flattering and terrifying. What did she find? His financial struggles? His failed business? His inability to provide Diego with the opportunities other children had? "I know about your landscaping business," Victoria continued, opening the folder. "I know about Rose's accident and how it destroyed everything you'd built together. I know about your current jobs, your financial situation, your son's academic achievements despite your circumstances." Gerald felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the wealth disparity between them. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why does any of that matter to you?" Victoria set the folder aside and looked directly at him. "Because I want to change your life, Gerald. I want to give you and Diego the opportunities you deserve. But more than that, I want to learn from you. I want to understand how someone can face the kind of hardships you've faced and still maintain the courage and compassion you showed last night."
She leaned forward, her voice becoming more urgent. "I have a proposal for you. It's going to sound crazy, and you're probably going to want to say no immediately, but I want you to hear me out completely before you respond." Gerald's heart was pounding. He thought about Diego at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably finishing his homework and getting ready for bed. Whatever Victoria was about to propose would affect his son's future as much as his own. "I'm listening," he said carefully. Victoria took a deep breath. "I want to offer you a job. Not a charity case, not a handout, but a real position with real responsibilities. My company is expanding into community outreach and social responsibility initiatives. I need someone to head that division, someone who understands what it means to struggle, what it means to need help, what it means to maintain dignity in the face of adversity." Gerald's heart was pounding. He thought about Diego at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably finishing his homework and getting ready for bed. Whatever Victoria was about to propose would affect his son's future as much as his own. "I'm listening," he said carefully. Victoria took a deep breath. "I want to offer you a job. Not a charity case, not a handout, but a real position with real responsibilities. My company is expanding into community outreach and social responsibility initiatives. I need someone to head that division, someone who understands what it means to struggle, what it means to need help, what it means to maintain dignity in the face of adversity." Gerald stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You want me to work for Ashworth Dynamics?" "I want you to work with me, not for me," Victoria corrected. "This would be a senior position, Gerald. 6-figure salary, full benefits, stock options. But more importantly, it would be a chance to create programs that actually help people like yourself, people who work hard but can't get ahead because the system is stacked against them." The numbers Victoria was mentioning didn't seem real. 6 figures? Gerald had never imagined earning that kind of money. It would mean Diego could have his own room, could attend better schools, could have the opportunities that came with financial security. But it also seemed impossible. "Victoria, I don't have a college degree.
I don't have experience in corporate management. I'm a janitor and a waiter." "You're a man who saved my daughter's life," Victoria replied firmly. "You're a single father who's raised a brilliant son while working 2 jobs. You're someone who understands hardship and maintains integrity despite it. Those aren't qualifications you can get from a university, Gerald. Those are qualifications you earn through living." She pulled out another document from the folder. "I've also taken the liberty of researching educational opportunities for Diego. There's a private school here in Highlands Ranch that specializes in gifted children. They've agreed to provide a full scholarship if you're interested." Gerald's vision blurred. A private school for Diego? The kind of educational opportunity he dreamed about but never thought possible? He thought about his son's excitement about the science fair, his hunger for learning, his casual acceptance of their limitations. "This is too much," Gerald said quietly. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Victoria set down her wine glass and looked directly at him. "Because yesterday, you showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind of strength that comes from money or power, but the kind that comes from character. I want to learn from that strength, Gerald, and I want to make sure that you and Diego have every opportunity to succeed." She paused, her voice growing softer. "But there's something else, something I haven't told you yet." Gerald waited, his heart pounding. "Lily hasn't stopped talking about you since last night. She keeps asking about the nice man who helped her breathe. She wants to thank you properly, and frankly, so do I. But beyond that, I think you and Diego could give Lily something she's never had, the experience of knowing people who value character over wealth, who understand that real worth isn't measured in dollars." Victoria stood and extended her hand. "Will you consider it, Gerald? Will you at least think about letting me change your life the way I changed mine?" Gerald looked at her outstretched hand, knowing that shaking it would mean stepping into a completely different world. A world where Diego could pursue his dreams without limitations, where Gerald himself might discover capabilities he'd never imagined possessing. But it also meant leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, everything he'd built through his own efforts. It meant trusting a woman he'd known for less than an hour with his and his son's entire future. As Gerald reached out to shake Victoria's hand, he realized that sometimes the most important decisions in life came down to a single moment of faith. And for Diego's sake, for the future he'd always dreamed of providing his son, Gerald was willing to take that leap. The handshake lasted longer than Gerald expected, Victoria's grip firm and warm, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize this moment. When they finally broke contact, Gerald felt as though he'd just signed an invisible contract that would reshape everything he'd ever known about his life. "There's someone who's been waiting very patiently to see you," Victoria said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and anticipation. "Lily has been asking about you every hour since she woke up this morning." Gerald's stomach fluttered with nervous energy. Meeting the child whose life he'd saved felt somehow more daunting than accepting a job offer worth more money than he'd ever imagined earning. Children possessed an honesty that adults learned to mask, and he wondered what Lily would see when she looked at him now, in her mother's world rather than in a moment of crisis. Victoria led him through corridors lined with original artwork that Gerald recognized from museum visits he'd taken Diego on free admission days. The house seemed to go on forever, each room more elegant than the last, until they reached a cozy family room where the scale felt more human. Here, the furniture showed signs of actual use, throw pillows askew, children's books scattered on side tables, and crayons left abandoned on a coffee table next to what appeared to be a half-finished drawing.
Lily sat on the floor in front of a television, building something elaborate with colorful blocks, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. She looked up when they entered, and Gerald was struck by how normal she seemed. Just a 5-year-old girl in pajamas with cartoon characters, her hair in pigtails, completely removed from the frightening scene of the previous evening. "Lily, sweetheart," Victoria said gently, "do you remember the man who helped you last night?" Lily's eyes widened as she focused on Gerald, and her face broke into a brilliant smile that reminded him achingly of Diego at that age.
She scrambled to her feet and approached him with the fearless confidence that only small children possessed. "You're the helper man," she exclaimed, stopping just in front of him. "Mommy said you made the candy come out so I could breathe again." Gerald knelt down to her eye level, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "That's right. I'm Gerald. How are you feeling today?" "Much better," Lily said seriously. "Mommy says I have to chew my candy more carefully from now on, and she says you're going to come work with us and maybe bring your little boy to play with me sometimes." Gerald glanced up at Victoria, who was watching their interaction with tears in her eyes. The hope in Lily's voice was unmistakable, the eager anticipation of a child who'd been promised a new friend. It added another layer of weight to his decision, knowing that disappointing Victoria would also mean disappointing her daughter. "I do have a little boy," Gerald said carefully. "His name is Diego, and he's 8 years old. He likes science and building things, just like you seem to." Lily's eyes lit up even brighter. "Can he come see my room? I have a telescope and a chemistry set that Mommy got me, but I don't know how to use them very well yet." The casual mention of expensive educational toys that Gerald could never afford for Diego was a stark reminder of the different worlds they inhabited. But there was no malice in her words, no awareness of the privilege she represented, just a lonely child excited about the possibility of making a friend. "Maybe sometime soon," Gerald replied, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep while also not wanting to crush her enthusiasm. Victoria stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, why don't you finish your tower while Gerald and I talk a little more? We'll be right here." As Lily returned to her blocks with renewed energy, clearly motivated by the prospect of showing off her creation, Victoria gestured for Gerald to join her on the couch nearby. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Lily work with the focused intensity that reminded Gerald and Diego during his homework sessions. "She's lonely," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying a note of sadness that surprised Gerald. "I've tried to give her everything, the best schools, the most enriching activities, every educational opportunity money can buy. But what I can't give her is what Diego has naturally, the experience of resilience, of finding joy despite limitations, of understanding that the most important things in life can't be purchased." Gerald considered her words carefully. It hadn't occurred to him that wealth might come with its own form of poverty, the absence of struggle that built character, the lack of constraints that taught creativity and resourcefulness. "Diego would love to meet her," I said honestly. "He's always been curious about how other kids live, especially kids who have access to the kind of educational tools that fascinate him." Victoria turned to face me more directly. "Gerald, I want you to understand that this isn't charity. This isn't me trying to ease my conscience by throwing money at you. This is me recognizing that you have something valuable to offer, not just to my company, but to my family." She paused, glancing toward Lily, who was now narrating an elaborate story about her block tower to an invisible audience. "I've spent years building a business empire, but I've never been more terrified than I was last night when I thought I might lose her. All my success, all my achievements, none of it prepared me for that moment of helplessness. But you were prepared, not with money or connections or power, but with the kind of presence of mind that comes from facing real challenges and learning to respond rather than react." I found myself thinking about the countless small crises I've navigated as a single parent. Diego's fevers in the middle of the night when I couldn't afford urgent care visits, broken appliances that required creative repairs, unexpected expenses that demanded immediate problem solving. I'd never thought of these experiences as valuable training, but perhaps Victoria was right. What exactly would this job involve? I mean, in practical terms, what would I actually be doing? Victoria's expression became more animated, and I could see the successful businesswoman emerging as she discussed her vision. "I want to create a foundation that addresses the root causes of poverty rather than just treating the symptoms.
emergency assistance for families facing crisis, educational support for children in underserved communities, job training programs that lead to actual career advancement rather than just temporary employment. She stood and moved to a bookshelf when returning with a thick folder that she placed on the coffee table between them. I've had my team put together some preliminary research on existing programs and their effectiveness rates. Most charity work in this country is feel-good nonsense that makes donors feel better without actually changing lives. I want to build something different, something that actually works.
Gerald opened the folder and found himself looking at charts, statistics, and program analyses that were far beyond his current understanding. But even with his limited background, he could see the pattern Victoria was describing. Lots of money being spent with minimal long-term impact. "You want me to help design programs that actually work," Gerald said slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what she was proposing. "I want you to help me understand what people actually need," Victoria corrected. "I can provide the resources and the business infrastructure, but I need someone who understands the reality of financial struggle, who knows the difference between help that empowers and help that enables." Lily appeared beside them suddenly, tugging on Gerald's sleeve. "Mr. Gerald, do you want to see my tower? It's taller than me now." Gerald allowed himself to be led to her creation, which was indeed impressively tall and surprisingly stable. As he admired her work and listened to her explain the engineering principles she'd discovered through trial and error, he found himself imagining Diego in this room, with access to these materials and this kind of encouragement. "It's beautiful, Lily," he said sincerely. "You're a very good builder." "Thank you," she replied, with the formal politeness of a well-trained child. Then, dropping her voice to a whisper, she added, "When Diego comes to visit, we can build something together, something even bigger." The assumption in her words, not if Diego came to visit, but when Diego came to visit, made Gerald's decision feel both more urgent and more inevitable. This child was already counting on him, already incorporating him and his son into her vision of the future. Victoria rejoined them, and Gerald could see in her face that she was trying not to appear too eager for his answer, but her anxiety was evident in the way she twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit that reminded her that despite her wealth and power, she was still just a mother who wanted the best for her child. "I need to talk to Diego," Gerald said finally. "This decision affects him as much as it affects me, and he deserves to have a voice in it." Victoria nodded immediately. "Of course. Would you like to bring him here tomorrow? Maybe for dinner. That way he can meet Lily and see what we're talking about before you make your final decision." Gerald thought about Diego's excitement that morning when he'd asked about the important meeting, about his son's dreams of opportunities that had always seemed impossibly out of reach. This could be the answer to every prayer Gerald had whispered in the dark during their hardest moments. But it could also be a mistake of epic proportions, a decision made in emotional response to crisis rather than rational consideration of consequences. What if he couldn't perform at the level Victoria expected? What if Diego couldn't adapt to the social pressures of wealth? What if they both ended up feeling more isolated than they had in poverty? "Tomorrow evening would be good," Gerald heard himself saying, despite his internal doubts. "Diego loves meeting new people, and I think he'd be fascinated by everything here." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Perfect. I'll have Harrison arrange for the car to pick you up around 5. That'll give you time to settle in before dinner." As they made arrangements for the following day, Gerald felt as though he was watching someone else's life unfold. The Gerald Mendez who cleaned office buildings and waited tables was fading away, being replaced by someone who attended dinner meetings in mansions and made decisions about foundations and educational opportunities. But as Lily showed him more of her toys and told her stories about her day at school,
Gerald realized that the most important part of this transition wouldn't be about money or status. It would be about the relationships they were building. Despite their vastly different circumstances, Lily was just a little girl who needed friendship, and Diego was just a little boy who deserved opportunities. Perhaps that common ground would be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds, to create something new and valuable for all of them. As Gerald prepared to leave the Ashworth estate that evening, he allowed himself to believe that sometimes life really did offer second chances to those brave enough to accept them. The conversation with Diego that night proved more challenging than Gerald had anticipated. As they sat at their wobbly kitchen table sharing a dinner of rice, beans, and the leftover chicken that Marta had sent home with Gerald, he struggled to find words that would accurately convey the magnitude of what Victoria was offering without overwhelming his 8-year-old son. "So this lady wants to give you a really good job because you helped her little girl?" Diego asked, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. His dark eyes, so much like Rose's, were serious as he processed the information. "It's more complicated than that, mijo," Gerald replied carefully. "She wants me to help her create programs that help families like ours, families who work hard but still struggle to get ahead." Diego nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question Gerald had been dreading. "Does this mean we won't be poor anymore?"
The directness of childhood cut straight through Gerald's carefully constructed explanations. Diego understood their situation with the clarity that came from living it daily: the generic cereal, the secondhand clothes, the conversations that stopped when he entered rooms because adults were discussing money they didn't have. "It might mean that, yes," Gerald said honestly. "But it also means big changes. We might have to move, you might go to a different school. Everything would be different." Diego set down his fork entirely, his expression growing more serious than any 8-year-old should have to be. "Papa, are you scared?" The question hit Gerald unexpectedly. He'd been so focused on the practical implications of Victoria's offer that he hadn't acknowledged his own emotional response. But Diego, with the intuition that came from 3 years of being Gerald's closest companion, had identified exactly what his father was feeling. "Yes," Gerald admitted. "I'm terrified. This woman is offering us opportunities I never dreamed we could have, but I don't know if I'm smart enough or good enough to deserve them." Diego stood up from his chair and moved around the table to hug his father, his small arms wrapping around Gerald's neck with fierce protectiveness. "Papa, you're the smartest person I know, and you're definitely good enough. You saved that little girl when nobody else could." The faith in Diego's voice was absolute, unwavering, and it reminded Gerald why he was considering this opportunity in the first place, not for himself, but for this remarkable child who deserved every advantage the world could offer. "Tomorrow, we're going to have dinner with Mrs. Ashworth and her daughter Lily. You can meet them and see what you think. If you don't feel comfortable, if anything seems wrong, we can say no and keep things the way they are." Diego pulled back to look at his father directly. "But if I do feel comfortable, we can say yes?" Gerald nodded. "If we both feel good about it, then yes, we can say yes." The next evening, as they rode in the same black sedan toward Highlands Ranch, Diego pressed his face against the window with unabashed amazement. His excitement was infectious, temporarily overriding Gerald's anxiety as his son pointed out landmarks and asked questions about the increasingly expensive neighborhoods they passed through. "Papa, look at that house! It has a swimming pool in the backyard," Diego exclaimed as they wound through the estate's entrance. "Do you think Lily knows how to swim?" Gerald smiled despite his nerves. Diego's wonder at this new world was exactly what he'd hoped for: curiosity rather than intimidation, excitement rather than resentment. Perhaps children were naturally more adaptable than adults, more willing to accept extraordinary changes as simply part of life's adventure. Victoria met them at the front door herself, having apparently dismissed the formal staff Gerald had expected. She was dressed casually again, in jeans and a soft blue sweater that made her seem more approachable than the commanding executive he'd first encountered. "You must be Diego," she said, kneeling down to his eye level. "I'm Victoria, and I'm so excited to meet you. Lily has been talking about you all day." Diego, who had been coached on proper manners during the car ride, extended his hand with formal politeness. "Thank you for inviting us to your house, Mrs. Ashworth. It's very beautiful." Victoria's smile was genuine as she shook his small hand. "Thank you, Diego. And please, call me Victoria. Mrs. Ashworth makes me feel old." As they were led through the house, Gerald watched Diego's reactions carefully. His eyes were wide with wonder, but there was no envy or resentment in his expression, just the natural curiosity of a bright child encountering something new. When they reached the family room where Lily was waiting, Diego approached her with the same straightforward confidence he brought to everything else. "Hi, I'm Diego. My papa says you like science." Lily's face lit up with delight. "I do. Do you want to see my chemistry set? It makes colors change and sometimes it bubbles." Within minutes, the two children were absorbed in Lily's collection of educational toys, their conversation a rapid-fire exchange of questions and discoveries. Gerald watched them with a mixture of pride and trepidation. Diego fit into this environment so naturally that it both thrilled and worried him. What if his son adopted so well to wealth that he forgot where he came from? "They're perfect together," Victoria observed, settling beside Gerald on the couch. "Lily needs someone who challenges her intellectually, and Diego seems to have that natural curiosity that makes learning fun rather than obligation." Gerald nodded, though his attention was divided between the children and his own internal struggle. "Diego's always been bright. His teachers say he's gifted, but we've never had the resources to really explore what that means." "That could change," Victoria said softly. "The school I mentioned, Highlands Academy, they specialize in gifted children. They have programs Diego couldn't access anywhere else. Science labs, advanced mathematics, computer programming, even philosophy classes for kids his age." The casual way she mentioned opportunities that would cost more than Gerald's annual salary made him acutely aware of the gulf between their worlds. But watching Diego explain some concept about gravity to Lily using blocks in a toy car, Gerald began to see past his own insecurities, to focus on what really mattered, his son's potential. "Can I ask you something?" Gerald said, turning to face Victoria more directly. "Why is this so important to you? You could hire anyone for this foundation position. You could find someone with an MBA and years of nonprofit experience. Why me?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching as Lily showed Diego how to use her telescope. "2 days ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I'd built a successful company, I was providing well for my daughter, I was contributing to various charities. I felt like I was doing everything right." She paused, her voice growing softer. "But when Lily started choking, when I realized I might lose her, all of that success felt hollow. I had surrounded myself with people who knew how to manage money and create strategic plans, but none of them knew how to save a life. None of them had the presence of mind to act when action was needed." Gerald understood what she was trying to say, but he still struggled to see himself as the solution to her problem. "Gerald, you've been poor," Victoria continued. "You know what it feels like to worry about paying rent, to choose between medication and groceries, to explain to your child why they can't have things other kids take for granted. That knowledge is invaluable. Most charity work fails because it's designed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to solve." Before Gerald could respond, Diego appeared beside them, with Lily close behind, both children flushed with excitement. "Papa, Lily has a computer that can show you what the stars look like from anywhere in the world," Diego announced. "And she says if I come to her school, we could be in the same advanced science class, even though she's younger, because she's really smart, too." Gerald's heart clenched. Diego had already begun imagining himself in this new life, already seen himself fitting into Lily's world. The hope in his son's voice was unmistakable, and Gerald realized that saying no now would mean crushing dreams that had only just begun to form. "That sounds amazing, mijo," Gerald managed to say. "Are you having fun?" "The best fun ever,"
Diego replied honestly. "Lily knows so much about science, and she says her mom has promised to get a bigger telescope so we can both use it. Can we really move here, Papa? Can we really stay?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that both adults fell silent. Gerald looked at his son's eager face, then at Lily, who was nodding enthusiastically in support of Diego's question, and finally at Victoria, whose expression made it clear that she wanted this as much as the children did. "We're still talking about it," Gerald said carefully, "but it's looking more and more like the answer might be yes." Diego's whoop of joy was so loud it echoed through the mansion, followed immediately by Lily's equally enthusiastic cheering. As the children hugged each other and began making plans for all the things they would do together, Gerald felt the last of his resistance crumbling. This wasn't just about a job or financial security anymore. It was about giving Diego a chance to reach his full potential, about giving Lily the friendship she needed, and about creating something meaningful from the chance encounter that had brought them all together. Victoria reached over and squeezed Gerald's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me with this, for being willing to take this leap." Gerald squeezed back, feeling for the first time that he might actually be making the right decision. "Thank you for seeing something in us worth investing in." As dinner was served and the children continued their animated conversation about science projects and star charts, Gerald realized that the most unexpected development wasn't the job offer or the financial security. It was the family they were all beginning to form together. Different from anything he had ever experienced before, but real and valuable in ways that had nothing to do with money. Outside, Denver's lights twinkled in the distance, but inside the Ashworth mansion, two families were discovering that sometimes the most important connections formed not despite their differences, but because of them. 3 weeks later, Gerald stood in his new office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, staring out at the same streets he had once walked as an invisible janitor. The transition had been swift and surreal. Within days of accepting Victoria's offer, he found himself with a corporate credit card, a team of assistants, and a corner office that overlooked half of Denver. The nameplate on his door read, "Gerald Mendez, Director of Community Impact," and every time he saw it, he still felt like he was living someone else's life. Diego had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children possessed in abundance. Their new apartment in Highlands Ranch, a 3-bedroom unit that Victoria had insisted was temporary until they found something more permanent, was larger than anywhere they had ever lived. Diego now had his own room filled with educational materials that Victoria and Lily had enthusiastically selected together. Most importantly, he was thriving at Highlands Academy, where his intellectual curiosity was finally being challenged and nurtured by teachers who understood gifted children.
The Foundation's first major project, an emergency assistance program that provided same-day help for families facing eviction or utility shutoffs, had already helped over 200 families in its first month. Unlike traditional charity programs that required extensive paperwork and waiting periods, Gerald's system was designed around the reality that financial crises demanded immediate response. However, not everyone had been pleased with Gerald's rapid ascension in Denver's social hierarchy. The announcement of Victoria's new foundation director had generated significant media attention, and not all of it had been positive. Some questioned whether a former janitor was qualified to manage millions of dollars in charitable giving. Others suggested that Victoria's decision was based on emotion rather than sound business judgment. The criticism had been painful, but it was the support that surprised Gerald most. Marta had become his biggest champion, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her boy who had saved a billionaire's daughter and now ran his own foundation. Frank, his former supervisor at Premier Building Services, had called to congratulate him and ask if the foundation might consider hiring some of his other employees for better positions. Even Mrs. Chanton had taken to introducing Diego as the boy whose father is changing the world. Today, however, would be Gerald's biggest test yet. Victoria had arranged for the foundation to be featured at the Denver Business Leaders Summit, an annual conference that brought together the city's most influential executives, politicians, and philanthropists. Gerald would be presenting their work to an audience of over 500 people,
including several who had publicly questioned his qualifications. "You ready for this?" Victoria asked, appearing in his office doorway. She looked confident and polished in her business suit, but Gerald could see the concern in her eyes. They had become close friends over the past 3 weeks, and she knew how much the public criticism had affected him. "As ready as I'll ever be," Gerald replied, straightening his tie. The suit he wore was expertly tailored, purchased with Victoria's assistance, but he still felt like he was wearing a costume. "The presentation is solid. The results speak for themselves." Victoria stepped into his office and closed the door behind her. "Gerald, I need to tell you something before we go to the summit. There are going to be people in that audience who want to see you fail. People who think I made a mistake by hiring you, who believe that poverty disqualifies someone from understanding how to fight poverty." Gerald had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so directly still stung. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to remember that their opinions don't matter," Victoria said firmly. "What matters is the work we're doing. What matters is the families we're helping. What matters is that you've accomplished more in 3 weeks than most nonprofit directors accomplish in 3 years." She moved to stand beside him at the window, both of them looking out at the city below. "But I also want to prepare you for what's going to happen after today. If your presentation goes well, and I believe it will, the media attention is going to intensify. People are going to want to know everything about your story, about Diego, about our working relationship. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" Gerald considered her question carefully. The past 3 weeks had already brought more attention than he'd ever experienced, but he sensed that Victoria was preparing him for something much larger. "What aren't you telling me?" Victoria turned to face him directly. "There's a documentary crew that wants to film our story. National television, Gerald. They want to follow our foundation's work, show how we're changing lives. It would mean incredible exposure for our programs, the ability to scale our impact nationwide." Gerald's stomach clenched. National television meant millions of people examining his life, his choices, his worthiness to hold this position. It meant Diego growing up in the public eye, their family story becoming entertainment for strangers. "It also means," Victoria continued, "that every mistake we make, every misstep, every human moment of imperfection gets broadcast for the world to judge. I won't make this decision without your full agreement, but I wanted you to think about it." Before Gerald could respond, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Mendez, the car is here to take you to the summit." The ride to the Denver Convention Center passed in contemplative silence. Gerald reviewed his presentation notes, while Victoria handled last-minute phone calls, but both of them seemed lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. The convention center buzzed with the energy of 500 of Denver's most powerful people. Gerald recognized faces from newspaper business sections and local TV news. These were the people who shaped policy, controlled resources, and determined which causes received support and which were ignored. As they made their way to the main auditorium, Gerald was aware of the attention they attracted. Conversations paused as they passed, heads turned, whispered commentary followed in their wake. He was no longer invisible, perhaps the most jarring change of all. "Ladies and gentlemen," the summit moderator announced as Gerald took the stage, "please welcome Gerald Mendez, Director of Community Impact for the Ashworth Foundation." The applause was polite but restrained, and Gerald could feel the skepticism in the room. These people were waiting for him to prove himself worthy of their attention, their respect, their support. "3 weeks ago," Gerald began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I was cleaning the offices in this very building. I worked 2 jobs, 16 hours a day, to keep my son and me barely above the poverty line. I know what it feels like to choose between rent and groceries, to explain to your child why they can't have things other kids take for granted, to feel invisible in a world that only notices you when you make a mistake." The room grew noticeably quieter, the restless energy settling into focused attention. Today, I stand before you not because I've forgotten those experiences, but because I've learned to use them. The Ashworth Foundation doesn't just write checks. We solve problems. We don't just provide charity. We create pathways to self-sufficiency. Gerald clicked to his first slide showing the stark statistics of traditional charity effectiveness. Most emergency assistance programs help families once and then move on. We've discovered that this approach actually perpetuates the cycle of crisis. Our model provides immediate help while simultaneously addressing the root causes of financial instability. As he walked through their results, families moved from crisis to stability, children kept in school, evictions prevented, utilities restored. Gerald felt his confidence growing. This wasn't about proving he belonged in their world anymore. This was about showing them a better way to use their resources. But perhaps most importantly, Gerald said, advancing to his final slide, we've learned that the most effective solutions come from those who have lived the problems we're trying to solve. Every program we've developed has been designed by people who understand poverty, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality. He paused, looking out at the audience that was now completely silent, completely focused. I didn't choose to become poor when my wife died. I didn't choose to struggle to provide for my son. But I can choose to use those experiences to help others avoid the same struggles. I can choose to turn my pain into purpose, my hardship into hope for other families. The applause that followed was different from the polite greeting he'd received. It was genuine, sustained, and came from an audience that had been genuinely moved by his message. As Gerald left the stage, Victoria met him in the wings with tears in her eyes. "That was incredible," she said, embracing him with the kind of pride he hadn't felt since Rosa used to celebrate his small victories. But as they made their way through the crowd of people wanting to congratulate Gerald, to ask questions about the foundation, to explore partnership opportunities, a reporter from the Denver Post approached with questions about his background. A television producer handed him a card and asked about availability for interviews. A documentary filmmaker introduced herself and explained her vision for telling their story to a national audience. Gerald looked across the room and saw Diego and Lily sitting in the back, having been brought by Victoria's assistant to watch his presentation. Diego was beaming with pride, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up, while Lily clapped excitedly. In that moment, Gerald realized that whatever came next, national attention, public scrutiny, documentary cameras, it would all be worth it if it meant these children could grow up in a world where hard work and compassion mattered more than the circumstances of your birth. The boy who had once felt invisible was now being seen by the entire country, and he was ready to use that visibility to change everything. 6 months after the Denver Business Leaders Summit, Gerald stood in the main hall of the newly opened Mendez Ashworth Community Center, watching as families from across the city explored the facility that had become the flagship location for their foundation's expanded mission. The building, a converted warehouse in the heart of downtown Denver, buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible to imagine when he was cleaning these same streets just months earlier. The documentary, From Invisible to Unstoppable, the Gerald Mendez story, had premiered on national television 2 weeks prior, generating a response that neither Gerald nor Victoria had anticipated. The film had followed their journey from that first charity gala through the development of their revolutionary approach to poverty intervention, capturing both the triumphs and the very real challenges of bridging two vastly different worlds. What had surprised Gerald most about the documentary's reception wasn't the praise, though there had been plenty of that, but the way it had inspired action across the country.
Within days of the premiere, their foundation had received calls from mayors in 12 different cities asking for guidance on implementing similar programs. Corporate leaders had reached out offering funding and partnership opportunities. Most meaningfully, hundreds of people who had experienced poverty themselves had volunteered to help design and implement programs in their own communities. "Papa, look what Lily and I built in the STEM lab," Diego's voice carried across the center's main hall as he approached with his best friend, both children flushed with excitement from their latest engineering project. At 9 years old, Diego had grown more confident and articulate, but he remained the same curious, compassionate child Gerald had always known.
The friendship between Diego and Lily had become one of the unexpected joys of their transformed lives. Despite their different backgrounds, or perhaps because of them, they had developed a bond that taught both children lessons about empathy, resilience, and the importance of using privilege responsibly. Lily had started volunteering at the community center's tutoring program, teaching younger children basic computer skills, while Diego had begun speaking at foundation events about the importance of educational opportunity. "Show me everything," Gerald said, allowing himself to be led toward the center's state-of-the-art learning facilities. The STEM lab was Diego's favorite space, equipped with technology that allowed children from underserved communities to access the same educational opportunities typically reserved for elite private schools. As they walked through the center, Gerald reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The facility housed not just emergency assistance programs, but also job training workshops, financial literacy classes, after-school tutoring, and small business development support. Each program had been designed based on input from people who had actually experienced the challenges they were addressing, creating solutions that worked because they were rooted in reality rather than theory. Victoria appeared beside them, her tablet filled with updates from their satellite locations in other cities. "Gerald, I just got off a call with the mayor of Phoenix. They want to implement our model there, and they're prepared to commit $5 million in municipal funding to get started." The numbers that had once seemed impossibly large now felt like tools for creating change rather than abstract concepts. Gerald had learned to think in terms of families helped, children educated, and communities strengthened rather than simply dollars managed. "Any word from the Washington team?" Gerald asked, referring to the policy advocates who were working to incorporate their approach into federal anti-poverty programs. "They think we have a real chance of getting pilot funding included in the next appropriations bill," Victoria replied. "Your testimony before the Senate subcommittee made a significant impact." Gerald still felt surreal about speaking to United States senators, but he had learned that his lived experience carried weight in ways that traditional credentials couldn't match. When he testified about the dignity of people experiencing poverty, about the difference between handouts and hand-ups, about the importance of treating symptoms and causes simultaneously, lawmakers listened with an attention that surprised everyone. The center's grand opening ceremony was scheduled to begin in an hour, and Gerald could see the media crews setting up their equipment. The attention still made him uncomfortable, but he had come to understand that visibility was necessary for creating change at scale. If telling his story inspired one more city to implement effective anti-poverty programs, then the discomfort was worthwhile. "Are you nervous?" Victoria asked, noticing his expression as he watched the reporters arrive. "Always," Gerald admitted. "But it's a different kind of nervous than it used to be. I'm not worried about whether I belong here anymore. I'm worried about whether I can live up to the responsibility that comes with this platform." Victoria smiled, the same expression of pride and affection that had become familiar over their months of partnership. Their relationship had evolved into something that transcended typical professional boundaries. They were friends, collaborators, and partners in creating something larger than either could have built alone. "You know," Victoria said quietly, "I used to think success meant having control over everything in my life, building walls high enough that nothing unexpected could reach me. But watching you speak at that summit, seeing how you've transformed not just your own life but hundreds of other lives,
I realize I had it backwards. Real success means being brave enough to be vulnerable, to let unexpected things in, to build bridges instead of walls. Before Gerald could respond, Marta appeared beside them, wearing her best dress and a smile that could have lit up the entire building. She had become something of a celebrity herself after appearing in the documentary, and her diner had seen a significant increase in business from people who wanted to meet the woman who had supported Gerald during his hardest days. "Mio, look at all this. Look at what you've built," she said, embracing Gerald with the warmth that had sustained him through countless difficult days. "We've built," Gerald corrected, gesturing around the bustling center. "None of this would exist without the community that supported us, the families who trusted us with their stories, the volunteers who believed in this vision." The ceremony itself was both celebration and call to action. Gerald spoke about the journey from cleaning these streets to transforming them, but he focused primarily on the work still to be done. Victoria announced the foundation's expansion to 10 new cities over the next year. Diego and Lily presented a scholarship program they had designed specifically for children aging out of foster care. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Chen took the microphone. Now in her 70s, she had become the center's volunteer coordinator, organizing the army of community members who kept the programs running smoothly. "I watched Gerald and Diego when they had nothing," she said, her accented English carrying clearly through the center's sound system. "I watched them take care of each other, maintain their dignity, never give up hope. Now I watch them take care of our whole community. That is what real wealth looks like, not what you have, but what you give."
As the ceremony concluded and guests toured the facility, Gerald found himself alone for a moment in the center's quiet library space. The walls were lined with photographs documenting the foundation's work, families moving into stable housing, children graduating from programs, small businesses opening with microloan support, communities transforming block by block. Diego found him there, carrying a framed photo that Gerald hadn't seen before. It showed Rosa, young and radiant, taken during their first year of marriage when they had been so full of dreams and plans for the future. "I found this in our old photo box," Diego said, settling beside his father. "I thought maybe we could put it here in the library, so Mama could see what we built with the love she gave us." Gerald's throat tightened as he looked at Rosa's face, seeing in her expression the same hope and determination that had carried them through their darkest times. "She would be so proud of you, mijo, of the man you're becoming, of the way you care about other people." "She would be proud of you too, Papa," Diego replied, with the wisdom that continued to amaze Gerald. "You didn't just save one little girl, you figured out how to save lots of families. You turned our sadness into something that helps people." As evening settled over Denver, Gerald and Diego walked home to their house in Highlands Ranch, not the temporary apartment Victoria had initially provided, but a real home they had chosen together, with a yard where Diego could practice soccer and a workshop where Gerald had started building furniture as a stress-relieving hobby. The transformation from invisible janitor to national advocate still felt surreal sometimes, but the relationships they had built felt completely natural. Victoria and Lily joined them for dinner twice a week, their families having become so intertwined that Lily had started calling Gerald Uncle Gerald and Diego referred to Victoria as Aunt Victoria. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the daily emails and phone calls from people across the country who had been inspired by their story to start their own community initiatives. Teachers who were implementing new approaches to working with children experiencing poverty. Social workers who were de-resigning assistance programs based on the Foundation's model. Former recipients of traditional charity who are now developing their own solutions to systemic problems. As Gerald tucked Diego into bed that night, a ritual they had maintained despite their changed circumstances, his son asked the question that had become their evening tradition. "Papa, what are we going to build tomorrow?" Gerald smiled, thinking about the program proposals on his desk, the cities waiting for their guidance, the policy changes they were advocating for in Washington.
But mostly, he thought about the children who would have opportunities because someone had been brave enough to see potential where others saw only problems. Tomorrow, mijo, we're going to build a world where every child has the chance to reach for the stars, just like you and Lily have. We're going to build a world where families like ours don't have to choose between dignity and survival. Diego nodded sleepily, satisfied with this answer as he was every night. Outside their bedroom window, Denver's skyline twinkled with possibility. The same view Gerald had seen from that service elevator months earlier. But now, instead of feeling invisible beneath those lights, he felt connected to them, part of a community he was helping to transform, contributor to a future he was helping to build. The journey from cleaning office buildings to changing national policy had taken less than a year, but Gerald understood it really was the culmination of a lifetime of experiences that had prepared him for this moment. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every night spent worried about providing for Diego had led to this: the ability to ensure that other families wouldn't have to face those same struggles alone. As Gerald tucked Diego into bed that night, a ritual they had maintained despite their changed circumstances, his son asked the question that had become their evening tradition. "Papa, what are we going to build tomorrow?" Gerald smiled, thinking about the program proposals on his desk, the cities waiting for their guidance, the policy changes they were advocating for in Washington. But mostly, he thought about the children who would have opportunities because someone had been brave enough to see potential where others saw only problems. "Tomorrow, mijo, we're going to build a world where every child has the chance to reach for the stars, just like you and Lily have. We're going to build a world where families like ours don't have to choose between dignity and survival." Diego nodded sleepily, satisfied with this answer as he was every night. Outside their bedroom window, Denver's skyline twinkled with possibility. The same view Gerald had seen from that service elevator months earlier. But now, instead of feeling invisible beneath those lights, he felt connected to them, part of a community he was helping to transform, contributor to a future he was helping to build. The journey from cleaning office buildings to changing national policy had taken less than a year, but Gerald understood it really was the culmination of a lifetime of experiences that had prepared him for this moment. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every night spent worried about providing for Diego had led to this: the ability to ensure that other families wouldn't have to face those same struggles alone. As Gerald tucked Diego into bed that night, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary changes began with the simplest acts of courage. Saving one child's life had led to saving hundreds of families. Being seen by one person had led to being heard by an entire nation. And somewhere in Denver, in cities across the country, and in the halls of Congress, the work of building a more just world continued, one family at a time, one community at a time, one courageous act at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.